So my name is Liz. I'm a graduate student at UC Riverside, and I really appreciate being here with you all. So thank you so much for inviting me. And today I'm going to be sharing the role that siblings play in the lives of teens who have autism, an intellectual disability, or who are neurotypical. So first, I just want to tell you a little bit about me. So one reason why I am especially glad to be here today is that I am also a sibling. So my sister has an intellectual disability. She's 2 years older than me. So growing up, I was always around children with disabilities. I volunteered with the Best Buddies program when I was younger, which is an organization focused on community inclusion. And then in college at UCLA, I started volunteering with an intervention program, working with children with autism. And this is where I fell in love working with autistic children. I was really struck by the heterogeneity of how each child presented with really unique strengths and challenges. And then after I graduated, I joined a neuroscience lab at the Center for Autism Research and Treatment at UCLA because I really wanted to better understand how to capture those unique differences and quantify them. And so now I'm at UC Riverside in my third year of my PhD in school psychology. And actually, I spend most of my time researching brain patterns of children with autism, but with Dr. Blatcher, my mentor who's on the call today, I'm able to kind of carry out more passion-based projects where I'm really interested in understanding how autism is experienced by the family unit. And of course, my experience having a sibling with a disability directly informs this work. Okay, so a little bit of background. What do we know about siblings? So in the 50s and 60s, there started to be this focus on how disability impacts the family. And there was this emphasis on how there was a reorganization of family processes. There was a lot of conversation about all the challenges and difficulties. And there was this really pervasive concept that siblings felt additional caregiving burdens that just weren't experienced in families without disabilities. And that these additional duties, included mostly worrying about finding care for their brother or sister in the future and what the impact or loss of their parents would have on them. And they also reported, feeling like they got less attention from their parents. And this early work, it really highlighted how important it is to take sibling mental well-being and wellness into consideration, given some of these added stressors. But it's really important to note that we've gotten a lot better at understanding that these perspectives are dynamic and changing. So they ebb and flow over time, such that these burdens might not be felt constantly. So, these feelings and experiences really should be classified as fluid. We should recognize that they're not fixed, but they're flexible over time. And with this in mind, and with updated research, we've learned that children who have siblings with disabilities don't only describe their relationship negatively, but instead they really recognize that there's both negative and positive aspects that they can feel at the same time. So some of these more challenging aspects include this additional caregiving responsibility that they feel at times, or feeling like they're a parent or guardian for their sibling, and also feeling less warmth if the sibling has a lot of behavior problems in particular. And then some of the more positives include that there are less conflicts between the siblings, there's less competition, and also they tend to be more tolerant of others given their experience of having a sibling with a disability. And so that's what research has told us from the perspective of the child without a disability. But we wanted to go a step further and understand how teens with disabilities describe their siblings. And we also wanted to understand how their parents viewed the sibling relationship. And I was really interested in seeing if parents and teens viewed the sibling as a caretaker. And so before I get into the data on the role of siblings, I want to tell you about the larger study that came from this work. So up in the corner here are Bruce Baker and Jan Fletcher, and they are a husband and wife team who have really transformed how we understand the context of neurodevelopmental disabilities in the family. And just as a side note, so Bruce was my advisor in college, and so I have been involved with this longitudinal study for probably close to 10 years now. And midway through this study, I got permission from Jan, again, who's on the call to share this. They had a grandchild who was diagnosed with autism. So they also have a really personal connection to this work. And what makes this work really phenomenal and thoughtful is that they set out to answer these big, really big questions about development and families that really hadn't been done in a systematic way. And, you know, what often happens in research studies is that participants will come into the lab, they'll fill out paperwork, maybe they'll do some tasks, and then they leave and we never see them again. But this study was fundamentally different because it was run by researchers who were also clinicians and who asked really impactful questions. So they got to know the families really well, and they followed children from the time that they were 3. So right on the cusp of preschool up until they were 21, where some of them were transitioning to college. And I really wanted to spend time highlighting this larger study because it has truly created a framework for studying family impacts. I don't know if you can hear the rain. I'm in Southern California, which is a rarity. So sorry if you can hear the background noise. Okay, so methods. So about this study. So we interviewed parents and teens separately when they came in for their 13-year time point of the study. So this is when all the teens were about 13 years old. And so these interviews were very comprehensive. We asked them about school, their social life, their thoughts and feelings on their family, and their life goals. And we also asked them about what they thought of their sibling, what type of relationship they have with them, and what kind of role the sibling plays in their life. And then we also asked similar questions to parents. So we talked with 77 neurotypical youth. So those are teens with no diagnosis and their parents, as well as 33 parents and teens with autism. And the autism group did include some teens who had an intellectual disability. And that was so we could fully capture the entire spectrum and some of that heterogeneity that I find really interesting. And then finally, we talked with 24 teens and parents or 24 parents and teens with an intellectual disability. And they only had ID. They did not also have autism. And given that these were interviews, I just want to note that the teens had to be verbal in order to participate, and that parents and teens were interviewed in separate rooms. So once we read through all the interviews, which were really lengthy, they tended to be about over an hour, we noticed that these 4 sibling roles came up the most. So describing the sibling as a friend, a teacher, a source of annoyance, or a caretaker. So here are findings, and I will walk you through all of the sections of this pie chart. So I wanted to represent this data visually rather than, kind of in a long table with numbers. So, but I am going to orient everyone to the figure. So the orange is the neurotypical group. And then in blue, we have the autism group. And then green is the ID group. And you'll see that the darker shades within each section represents parents. So here, here, and here. And then the lighter shades represent the teen responses. And then the very outer ring of this sunburst shows how often each group described the sibling role. So for example, So for example, teens in the neurotypical group mostly describe their sibling as a friend. And you know that because the friend section is the largest, followed by describing them as a teacher, and then a small percentage of them describe them as being a source of annoyance, okay? So that's sort of how to read this chart, and I'm gonna go through some of the main highlights. So in the neurotypical group, most of the parents and teens saw the sibling as being a friend, and they tended to agree. And then in the autism group, most of the teens saw their sibling as being a friend. You can see that because that's the biggest section. And their parents tended to agree that they also perceive the sibling to, be a friend. And they also describe them as being a teacher. And then you'll notice here in the teens with autism that there is this larger section for annoyance. So they describe their siblings as being more annoying than all of the other groups. So that's, something to note. And then finally in the ID group here, most of the teens describe their sibling as being a friend in this section here. And parents also described the sibling as being a friend, but more so a teacher. That was the largest percentage in the ID group. That's how they saw the sibling. And what's really important about this, and what I found very interesting, was that no parents described the sibling as holding the role of a caretaker, which based on some of that work from the 1950s and 60s was sort of the opposite of what I expected to find. So some major takeaways. So all the teens in every group saw their sibling mostly as a friend. And this is very positive. So it didn't matter if the teen had a disability or not, because they described having found companionship with their siblings. And in the neurotypical and autism group, those parents saw the sibling as a friend as well. So that's, again, these really highly positive descriptions. And autistic teens did describe their siblings to be more annoying than the other groups. And when you think about autism, this sort of makes sense given the social communication difficulties that are often experienced. And then parents in the intellectual disability group, they describe the sibling as being a teacher. And this is really important to think about because we think that this reflects a really positive parental view of the sibling relationship. And parents really see the siblings more as peer models than caretakers, which, really shows a lot of resilience in this group that they describe the siblings so positively. And again, like a peer model. So this study highlights the importance of getting the perspective of teens with disabilities. And it also sheds light on the importance of sibling dynamics within the family unit. And as for next steps, so we have followed these teens into adulthood and we've kept in touch with them, which is one of the greatest, parts of this study, that we have kept up with them as they've aged. And so we would love to know if this positive sibling relationship continues into young adulthood and how this might relate to well-being and family and how the family unit operates. So I just want to, I'm close to the end of the talk, but I really want to highlight that siblings are really important in a family, especially a family with disabilities. And clinically, we often ask children with autism to describe, what being a friend is and what being a friend means to them. And they often say, a friend is kind, or you hang out with them, or you care about them, but they have a much harder time understanding their own role in friendship and where they fit. So it's really lovely to see that all the teens in the study, including those with autism, find companionship within their own family. And that individuals who have social communication difficulties like autism can count their sibling as a friend. And for me, given that my sister has ID, this has really helped me recognize that my role is not characterized so much by negatives, but that it is this dynamic, complex relationship with ebbs and flows, with negatives and positives, but that all of those are strengthened by the fact that we have a sibling bond. And also what's really important is as a field, we have gotten so much better over the last 60 years at really properly characterizing disability as it's experienced firsthand within the family and how that affects interpersonal relationships in the family. And I think a big part of this is because we've taken the time to talk with the child who has neurodevelopmental disabilities themselves. And we've heard what they have to say, and we've listened to what they have to say. So thank you all for listening and having me and allowing me to share, you know, a really important snippet of this larger study. This work is, you know, very important to me, and I'm really glad that I got to share it with you all. And I'm very grateful to the families who have stuck around and been in the study for so long. And of course, this work is not done, you know, by myself. It's done with, I have to thank all the lab members who have contributed. So thank you very much. And I know now we're going to go into discussion. So I have some questions posted. Alicia and Sam, I didn't know if you guys usually go free form after this, but I can leave these up or I can take them down.
I think those are a great starting point that we can definitely build from. So you can leave them up there. And then we might, depending on what the questions are, like I know Alicia posted one in the chat, depending on what the questions are, we might ask you to go back through some of the slides. But starting off with Alicia's question, it was kind of on the more logistical side. So she asked, I want to make sure that I'm getting this right. None of the parents saw the siblings as a caregiver, but did any of the siblings see themselves in that role?
So we only talked with siblings with disabilities, and excuse me, let me go back to this slide. So there were some teens who saw actually was only ID teens. So teens who had intellectual disability. A small percentage of that group saw their sibling as sort of being in a caregiver role. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a really interesting point, given that this is like our edge cases of the spectrum in a way, and how that's the only group that's seeing them like the sibling relationship as caregiver, because it has a little more theory of mind to it, which is one of the things that like is characteristically difficult for people on the spectrum. But we can totally go back to your questions that you had on that last slide now, because I think that they were very useful.
See, of course I had to do all these animations. Okay, here we go.
Can I just jump in? I'm sorry, both of us, Jan. I just wanted to know why you guys decided on 13-year-olds. Sorry, I'll let you go after that. Why that age? I would say it's the most problematic age for any teen. Why on Mother Earth would you want to ask a 13-year-old for their opinions?
Well, that's a very good question. I think I need to answer that instead of Liz. There were several things at play. Number one, NICHD had been funding us for 17 years, and we were going right through the teen years. And NIH was extremely interested in the transition to adolescence. And that was, you know, based on the reviews and different conversations that we had with them. That was sort of a key reason they funded us through this period. And we have a lot of data we haven't published, like their risk behaviors and this psychosexual development and actual physical characteristics during that time. And yes, yes, it is a very tumultuous period. And because we had a typically developing control group, well, I wouldn't call it control, a neurotypical group, just a comparison group, it became even more interesting. And Liz doesn't have the data to show, but we could pull it. And what we found that was so interesting is that the stresses at 13 didn't differ that much across these diagnostic groups, so that our teens with intellectual disability and the autistic teens and the neurotypical teens were all facing, you know, similar levels of anxiety or depression or challenging behaviors. To underscore your point, it's a really difficult time. And some of the literature suggests that for those on the spectrum, some of these challenging periods continue a bit longer, you know, they stretch out. We haven't yet examined those data or found that, but that was sort of one of our hypotheses about this. But great question.
I just think if you ask a child younger, under the teen age, caregiver would probably, you know, be a word that I don't probably understand that well, but they would see them more as that. I think that whole answer would be different. And I'd be really interested to see in the updated one that you do with the adults that you followed. That would be, to compare the two would just blow me out of the water. I think you'd be very surprised.
One of the things Liz, emphasized though, is the dual respondents. So by having parents also respond as well as the teen, you get some sense of whether they're seeing the world at all in the same way. And in adulthood, I think they diverge a bit more. One last thing, and I think Liz should take over. Our group of teens with autism was expanded at age 13. And we actually had about 60 of them. But when the study began, autism was actually a rule out way back in the early 90s. We were looking at ID, mild ID, and neurotypical development. But through the years, about a dozen of our participants, in fact, were reliably diagnosed as having ASD. So when we refunded, we said, you know what, let's systematically pick a larger sample of those on the spectrum without ID, because we already had some with ID. And that. So we don't have the 3-year-old data to look at siblings, but Liz could certainly look at SIB and parent responses for ID going back a little bit.
Yeah, and I
sorry, Liz, go for it.
I was just going to say, I'm just going to reemphasize that the developmental period of adolescence is explosive in every way. There's so much going on. It's like, it's this process where there's new, even like brain connections forming. There's new ways to express themselves. Independence is becoming a bigger emphasis. And just like Jen said, it's really fascinating that a lot of these groups are experiencing the same feelings at this age. So that's all I wanted to say.
Liz, why don't you tell them about your work on adaptive behavior and looking at that in autism and ID?
Yeah, so adaptive behaviors. So those are practical skills like how do you get dressed in the morning? Do you wake up by yourself? Does someone have to get you up? If you're hungry, do you know how to make snack? Can you properly ask for directions if you're trying to get somewhere? Things like that. So for teens with autism, what predicts these more than anything is actually externalizing behaviors. So those types of behaviors that you see of, sometimes it might be aggression or acting out, that, for kids who spend time interacting with others that way or expressing themselves through these externalizing behaviors, it's actually really hard for them to do things independently. And that's definitely, it's something to consider in autism, is that these adaptive behaviors are impacted. And so the more that we can figure out why and measure that, I think the more that we can sort of start to really think about outcomes later in life and really try to bolster some of those skills.
In a similar, we have a bunch of questions. I just wanted to go off of what my mom was saying a minute ago and what you guys kind of confirmed, is that I think that when your data takes up this next transition period to adulthood, I think that that's going to continue to either diverge or just be a really interesting portion, because I think that the transition to adulthood is where we see the stressors begin to change between groups a little more than they do in childhood. Because around 13, you're still in school, you're still doing all sorts of things that are very structured. At least for like my growing up with my brother at our younger years, we were actually in the same school. And then that became more divergent as we kept moving forward. So I think that that'll be a really interesting study when, let's say, the neurotypical sibling ends up going to work and things like that, and then to see what happens between that relationship as there's less to relate to. Could be really cool data. We do have a bunch of questions. So actually, Kim made a really good point that was saying, because Kim does a lot of work with younger siblings, she has really good support groups in which there's like a mentorship program that goes on, which is fabulous. So they get some more perspective from the younger ones. And she said that I've heard younger siblings describe their role more as the older sibling, quoting that I am more like the big brother than the little brother, rather than describing themselves as necessarily a caregiver or a parental figure. So even in those like adolescent minds, there's a little bit of translation through that, which is really cool to see actually, and definitely something that I can relate to. And I think that Nathan, who actually is the younger sibling, can relate to that pretty strongly as well.
Yeah, I think that just to comment, Sam, really quickly, I know we have quite an agenda to get through, but I agree. I think part of it is just developmentally as kids, it's easier to understand roles in that way. So part of this is how language is also conceptualized over time and how children are able to express themselves, which we're able to see in these interview formats more so than in other formats.
Yeah, I think especially given that your interviews are separate from the parents, as you were saying, right? It's just a one-on-one type of setting. So I can imagine that you're getting some pretty raw responses. Another one that we saw, question from Meredith is, do we have any data on whether there were a lot of single parents in this study? And if so, did you see any differences in how they perceived their siblings compared to parents who had a partner?
You know what? I'm going to let Jan answer this because I don't know off the top of my head marital status for these families.
Over the years, we've looked really carefully at proxies for socioeconomic status. And one of them is marital status. One of them is race or ethnicity. And overall, SES or social economic status does have a huge bearing on almost everything. And in fact, we've even thought about writing another grant focused just on SES, but not really parental status in and of itself. In part because a lot of the parents were still involved, even if they were separated or divorced. And remember, we are aware of the bias in the sample, right? I mean, it's a unique set of families that wants to stay with us for 17 years. So obviously, we didn't have the most chaotic or disorganized families to begin with. Gender's a tricky one because, as you know, autism is so much more likely among males, as is ID. So it's tough to analyze. I don't recall that we've ever done a paper that has focused totally on gender. So Liz, make note. Again, these are really insightful and terrific questions.
I think the gender question is particularly interesting to us because some of our previous speakers who have come in to show their research has shown a connection between how that relationship develops when it's the gender matched sibling relationship versus when it's different. And so in some of the studies that we were looking at, the gender matching would sometimes have a positive effect on the sibling relationship, or the perceived sibling relationship, I should say.
Misunderstood that. So you were talking about gender just within a sibling relationship. We do have a couple of papers on that. It's going to tax my memory, mostly done by Ghazi Begum on our staff. But yes, gender matching and usually a stronger relationship when at least one of the Sibs was a girl.
Yeah, that lines up with a lot of the things that we've seen as well. Which I would actually be interested to hear what your perspective is.
I think there's so much about gender we don't know.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of that has to do with, of course, like societal roles in general and how caregivers are perceived and all that sort of stuff. So there's so many confounds in that it's really difficult to isolate. Which, yes, I've had this problem in my own research.
I mean, there's a gender bias in who diagnoses autism and how frequently it's diagnosed and how it's diagnosed. And the items on our gold standard instruments may be biased toward males and not females. So this gender issue is far more global, I think, than we originally thought.
The same that you were saying with SES, especially regarding race. A lot of the samples that have been used for these types of studies have been biased. And when you have a biased sample that you're using to create tools, you end up with a biased tool as well, which is really difficult because, as you were saying, it's hard to get families that are in more chaotic situations to sign up for a study that's adding potentially more chaos to their lives. And especially keeping them for 17 or more years is no small task and no small ask of them either. So it's really impressive that you actually have this many families that are into it. I did have a question if there was any, if you had the data on how many siblings were in the family and whether you asked multiple siblings within a family, if there were multiple.
We have data on how many siblings are within each family, but we didn't ask them any of these interview questions. We only asked the one child who was in the study. So yeah, it would have been great if we had the opportunity to have talked with the other siblings as well. Yeah.
Yeah, over the years, we conducted 1 or 2 studies with siblings with ID before we added the larger sample with ASD. And one thing this will be of interest to you. It was a study by Judith Wilson et al. Liz, if you want to look it up, it's way in the early years. She was an attorney who got her PhD with us at UCLA in the Department of Psychology. And what we found was shocking. We found that siblings of young children with intellectual disability were so aware of their brother or sister's program. They knew what an
Jan, I think you might have frozen.
Yes, for me as well. I was thinking that it might be my own.
I will text her and let her know to maybe rejoin the call.
While we're at it, just for anyone that's not on the chat, our conversation about data across gender is going pretty well. And so Alicia was saying that the disparity in diagnosis makes it very difficult to do some gender analyses unless you over-recruit females and girls. But she does agree that that needs to happen. There needs to be some more data analysis across those. But I did want to hear from Nathan. Yes, good
perfect timing. Yeah, well, I want to say thank you for this presentation. And the research is super interesting, very awesome findings. But I was going to say, I feel like my perspective on it is a little bit different, largely because my brother is nonverbal. And so I've never really been explicitly able to hear his perspective. And he's pretty severely impacted, so he wouldn't really be eligible to do a study like this. But and he's never explicitly told me this, but I feel like he often thinks that I'm frustrating because I'm always trying to get him to do stuff with me. And but from the sibling perspective, I would say I think this has been really insightful because I can't explicitly understand how he's feeling about me or my parents and what his frustrations or stressors might be. And so I think this work is really useful for that matter. But from my perspective, I also think the longitudinal study is really important because I think my perspective has changed so much over the years. I think it really started from not really understanding what was going on to being aware of our differences and then at times being embarrassed or frustrated. And now I really feel like at the age of 21 and my brother's 23, now I really don't feel those same emotions surrounding it. So I think it's really important to look at the change over time instead of a single point in time, and largely just because it's changed so much around the ages of 13 to 17. So I think that's really important.
I think also that embarrassment piece comes when you're growing up with your sibling, like you're both developing at the same time. And it can be really hard to, especially when your sibling is nonverbal, and it can be harder to communicate with them, to really try to understand their behaviors. And in public, that can be really hard when you're dealing with strangers and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I wish we had a better way of sort of across the board in research, kind of quantifying some of those nonverbal behaviors in order to sort of understand how they might experience interpersonal relationships in the family. But yeah, like you said, longitudinally, at least this is a good first step at understanding that feelings change. They are stable at times. As you're developing, you have a growing conception of disability as well.
Sure.
So it's constantly ever changing, really complex relationship. Yeah.
I agree. I think in Charles's case, he used to be able to talk. He was verbal for a while, and then around the age of 7 or 8, his onset of his epilepsy caused him to regress and lose those skills, and slowly he's become nonverbal. So I know he had the capacity to tell us, his emotions or things that were stressing him out or his frustrations, and now he doesn't have that. And so I can imagine it's even more frustrating for him, and it's even more challenging for us as a family to understand those frustrations. And so I think this work particularly is very insightful for me for that reason. So
I completely agree with a lot of the things that Nathan has been saying in terms of just having such a bigger pool, because I don't really get to ask Ben these types of questions, because while he is verbal, it's difficult to know how much of that is like self-reflective. So it's really interesting to see how he's begun to relate to other people as he grows up, because he's now, oh my gosh, wait, I almost said he's 17. I think he just turned 19, Mom.
19. Excuse me, please.
Oh no, it's heinous. Anyway, so he's
very forceful now in his wants and his not wants, his likes and his dislikes. But I agree with Samantha. I don't know on an emotional, intellectual level, if he'll never be able to describe those feelings in words that make sense to us, which I agree with Nathan there, that for us, it's nice for those that are verbal. Although I listen and I read and I still think I don't agree with some of those. I still think he has a different perspective on that. And I do think that growing up, and maybe at age 13 still, whether your sibling is younger or older than you at that age is going to make a big difference in your answers too. Because if it's 13 and your siblings are younger than you, you're not really looking at them as caregivers, definitely not if you're verbal and able to answer those questions. I think if you weren't verbal and you were 13, then that younger sibling, no matter the age, is probably already to some degree being your teacher and your caregiver. So that age thing there would be interesting also for me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that we want to look at as well, is the sibling that they're talking about, if they're older or younger, because I completely agree with you. If it's a 5 to 7 year age gap, the direction really matters, right? Because they could be someone who's closer to adulthood or someone who's, a lot closer to toddlerhood. And obviously that's absolutely going to have an influence on responses, or it may.
And one of the unique things I think with autism is that often, even if an autistic teen is verbal, they may not express their desires and wants for independence, but they sure do want them. I mean, I speak from experience, and, having a 14-year-old grandson, I mean, it's very clear that in many ways he wants to behave like a neurotypical 14-year-old, but he can't really express those desires. So they don't always come out as appropriate.
I was going to say, I am curious to see kind of the severity of the diagnosis, or the severity of impact affects how these siblings' perspective change, because I feel, and you had mentioned earlier some of the bias with these families, like I feel like Sam's family and my family are probably much more likely to be involved in a long 17-year study. But I mean, beyond that, how families that have much more severely impacted children would have a very different perspective on this matter. So
yeah, I think some of those strengths are really worth looking at. And something like severity level, or even adaptive behavior, like how can they operate independently, or how much help do they need? Things like that, I imagine, are going to absolutely impact how they view all of their family members. Yeah.
I'm actually curious to see if my mom and I's perspective differs on what my role is. Because from my perspective, it's been a lot of caregiving and teaching. Like my brother is still it's become more friendship the older that we've gotten, but I feel like my earlier relationship with him was a lot more protective, and I would be very upset if people were not interacting with him in a way that I was like happy with and felt like it was fair to him and things like that. And so I was very protective and very caregiving, and still am, absolutely. But I think that a lot of that has turned more into friendship as he's adapted to my interests as well. So Liz, this is the first time that we've ever spoken about this, but everyone else on the call knows that my brother loves to watch YouTube videos for days and loves to watch different snippets of movies, and he'll play these little segments and he'll assign a segment to different people, depending usually on what made you laugh the most, because that's his favorite thing in the world. So he'll assign these segments and then remember them forever. He might not remember, he probably won't remember your name, but no one in my family is good with names. So probably he'll give you a snippet, and that snippet, he'll say the first thing that you see him. If he doesn't swear at you first, he will give you your snippet back. And that's how he collects memories of people. And it's really fun to watch that. So as we've gotten older, his sense of humor has become a lot more like mine, much to the chagrin of my poor parents. There is, in fact, 2 of us, and one of them still lives at home. So it's been interesting to see how much that's changed. But I do feel like a lot of my growing up was caregiving. And even when I go home now, I'm there to help my parents with Ben and make sure that we're working as the unit that we used to be before I moved to college and started like life things. So I think it's been interesting, especially over the college, to see how much more that's changed to friend, because he's not only mine to take care of anymore.
Right.
Mama, what do you think?
No, I agree with you. I think when it started off, when she was really, really little, the first role was protector, very much so, trying to even overrule things and decisions that we thought was appropriate and correct. And she would have no problem telling us that she thought they were not the way to be treating him, and that we were letting him get away with murder. And, you know, if there was a teacher or a therapist coming to the house that he didn't like, she would vocalize her opinion of said person quite clearly, and that they were not welcome there. But yes, the roles definitely change and keeps changing, which is good, and which is why your study is also so interesting. I think we can talk for days, but her role changes only because she's not here anymore. But when she is home, it is very easy for me as a parent now, because I trust her fully, to ask her to take him somewhere or to go collect him somewhere. And I also know the joy that it gives him when she's home to spend more time with him. So it's not that I need to encourage it. They both gravitate to one another in any case. But I'm going to do something here, just because she told you guys about his addiction to the YouTube. So I'm sitting in our kitchen, and that sliding glass door over there, I don't know if you can see that, is actually his office. So I can sit in the kitchen, or we can be sitting outside, and he can be doing his favorite thing, but not feel so cut off from the rest of the family. So he can open his sliding glass door when he wants us in his world, and quickly shut us out if he doesn't want us there. So with us still be able to see him. And this has been, we've just moved here. So my favorite part of this house, I just had to share, because it opens this communication line for us. As he gets older, to me, that's become more and more important, because he is extremely social, but he also has that draw to everything on the computer. So, you know, just a little snippet of our life.
What's also really cool about that is the interaction and the autonomy that it gives him, because I feel like a lot of the times that's how we become the annoyances in our siblings' lives, is because the setting of boundaries is so different within our relationships as it would be in most sibling relationships, but it's still so important. And I think that him having that opportunity to now open and shut his door while still being interactive enough has been huge for his development as a human. Just as a person, he gets to grow up and he gets to decide for himself now.
I think it's brilliant. I'm thinking about, I have been in the homes of literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of families, okay, like yours. And, of course, I don't remember them all, but various ones are spinning in my mind of youth that would so benefit from this arrangement. It's almost like, you don't want to suggest their bedroom door is glass because they need some privacy, right? But having this office arrangement is absolutely brilliant. And it's making me think about prototypes for all kinds of living arrangements for individuals like this. And I'm going to really think about that for a while. It's so developmentally appropriate.
Yeah.
It's socially appropriate. It totally maximizes, the ability for your son to interact, but also to have autonomy to not interact. It just, I can check off all the boxes here.
The only thing missing at the moment is the curtain so that he can really shut us out there, but it's coming.
Yeah. And then you might want it electric so you can control it on both sides. But I'm just thinking
I tell you, he's controlling my lights from his room. So it's a absolute another game that's added to this. He decides if we're in the light or in the darkness, which is a challenge also.
It's his favorite new thing because I love to read in that little space that's out there. But a lot of times I'll read in the evenings right before we do our nightly routine, which involves me being present for a lot of mayhem in the room. But he'll sit there, and if I'm not paying enough attention to him, because he likes, even when the glass is closed, he wants you to look. So he doesn't always, there's intermediate steps to the interaction, but he wants attention, which makes sense. Again, it's our family. And so he really loves having a little bit of interaction. And if I'm not giving him that, he'll flip that light switch and then just laugh at me from the glass door and not open it because he doesn't want to hear me yelling.
It's funny.
Yeah. It's almost like that house was purpose built.
It's very clever.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this was a good find, I must say. Very happy. Total jellyfish, Samantha, get us back on track.
It's important to be able to jellyfish because we're just going through familial roles. But I think that it's going to be, again, really interesting to see how that is going to change with time, because a lot of these, as Jan was saying, a lot of these setups, even the physical setup of the home, the setup of the family, those things need to adapt with time. Because if we had this earlier on in my brother's development, or even in our own time, it wouldn't have worked out as well. So another thing that is really useful to us is that my relationship with my brother has always been really close because our bedrooms have been physically located right next to one another. And so there was always this interaction of in the morning we brush our teeth together, or at night we need to be quiet, or we're doing certain things. And so I think the physical closeness had a lot to do with that. And I know that for the college age people that I speak to now, with my group at Stanford, a lot of that changes in that college era because we're not in the daily routines anymore. And so then coming back, I know that we had one of our previous panelists, so a sibling, was saying that his brother didn't speak to him for days when he came back because he was so angry that he'd left. And so obviously there's a really tight connection, but that the description, I don't even know which category that would fall into. And so it's, there's a lot to do here, and I'm really excited to see what you guys have. We have a couple minutes left in case anybody has leftover questions as well. Oh my gosh, for once we might actually be on time. That's spectacular.
Well, I wanted to maybe add on to the discussion of gender to say that this is a problem that pervades all of autism research because of the diagnostic disparity. And even if you were to think about, there's been analyses about whether or not you were to, right now it's 4-to-1 according to the CDC. If you were to even consider biases or diagnostic biases or ascertainment biases or things like that, there would still be a disparity of 3-to-1. So there are going to be less females diagnosed, and there are going to be less females enrolled in research. And so one of the recommendations that I think a lot of researchers are making is that you over sample. So you over recruit for females, because if you don't, you'll always end up in a sample of 100 with 80 boys and 20 girls. And I also want to reiterate that there seems to be some very subtle differences between boy-girl sibling, boy-girl siblings, girl-girl siblings, and then boy-boy siblings. And, of course, things play a role in that. And there also seems to be a little bit of cultural differences in terms of relationships in African-American families and Hispanic families. The way to get to that is to make sure that they are included in research, which is, a number one top priority. But I think that these subtle differences across gender and ethnicity and race make a difference, but I think that the message is still consistent in that, having a sibling who isn't on the spectrum helps with adaptive behavior in the long term when these kids who are, anywhere between 2 and 13 and older return to adults. And that the family dynamic, in fact, is different than those who do not have autism in the family, which is just is something. The reason why this webinar series is put together is to help kind of navigate through all of that.
Lisa, I had a question and I was trying to type, and unfortunately my keyboard stopped working in the middle of it. So my question is really, in looking at, Lisa, what you had mentioned about the population of 13-year-olds and looking at gender disparities and diagnostics with autism and how late females typically get diagnosed. And Jan and Liz, understanding you followed these individuals for 17 years, did you look at, or have you seen any trend in female siblings that were participating as a neurotypical sib in your studies that got later diagnoses after going through puberty and adolescence, not realizing that possibly they were on the spectrum themselves? And if so, are you interested in looking back retrospectively at that data?
Well, if we go back 17 years, Liz is probably a lot younger than you think she is, so I suspect she wasn't thinking a whole lot about data. But we weren't systematically looking at that during all those years. And of course, hindsight is worth $1 billion, right? I think those are really important questions moving forward. I mean, my dream would be to use this valuable sample and add to it going forward. And I love the idea of, this oversampling idea, but, oversampling females and then filling the cells across ethnicity requires not only a very large sample, but the willingness of a very large number of families to be in something like that. And that's a real need that we all need to think about, is gathering a large enough N to be able to do these long-term panel analyses to answer some of the questions that you're all bringing up, especially about siblings. I love this idea of, looking at diagnostic implications for the sibling. I'm not aware of a lot of cases where the neurotypical sib developed a full-blown diagnosis of autism, but many of them had things like learning disabilities, other sorts of mild special ed needs. But for the most part, we would consider them neurotypical.
Thank you.
Great question. Liz, you might want to speculate on that because you're familiar with the data set, although you weren't around in the early days.
No, I'm not super familiar with what that data might look like, but I think the question is fantastic and one that, would be interesting to investigate because of these gender disparities and understanding, I think the more we can also understand risk and resilience of females with disabilities, you know, that would be really fruitful in terms of better serving them, and again, better serving families. So yeah, it's something that, I mean, I didn't have my notebook next to me, but I have like a mental list of these amazing questions and ideas that everyone has posed, because they're things that there's larger things at play that I would really like to incorporate into this work.
I can't emphasize enough how valuable it is. And I feel very fortunate, as does Bruce Baker, that we have this sample, because as we tackle these new questions you've all raised in the next project, we still have this to mine and to guide us and direct us, you know, to the appropriate new questions. And so it's a very, it's kind of the gift that keeps on giving, I think.
Thank you guys so much for sharing this as well. And it's amazing that almost everyone here always has those personal connections. So there's always something to talk about and something to laugh about. And that was the original point of these webinars. So thank you guys so much for participating and also bringing this amazing data to light for us. It's really been a treat.